Hello everyone. So in the previous video we were able to talk about Blender's lighting types and how it works. In this video we're going over the camera. So let's finally get into Blender's camera system. And Blender's camera system is basically it basically represents the viewer's perspective in render. So it's probably the most important tool you need when you're finishing up your scene. It's the only way to actually view your render through the export and renders options. So let's quickly go into that. To add your camera, now everything is black in my scene. Let me just quickly add an area light. Let me just do that, and let's light our objects from the side maybe, and increase the light. One thing we can also do is make this a rectangle. And the beautiful thing about the area light is we can also control the radius at which the light is emitted. So you can see by adjusting the spread option, we have we can widen the area at which our light is emitting, and we can reduce. So you can see we have it's really my favorite tool, or favorite lighting type in Blender. And let's go ahead and add let's add a camera into our scene. And let me also switch back to viewport shading, because that's being in cycles might be a little bit laggy for your system. I've added my camera in Blender, and you see in our properties panel, you can see in our outliner we have our camera there now. And if I should adjust this, if I just move it to the left and then drag it up, you see that our camera is now in scene. So how do we control our camera, and how do we see through our camera, right? To do that, we have a couple of options. We can go to view, can come all the way to view, camera, or rather active camera, and you switch to your camera view. Or if you have a numpad on an external keyboard or your laptop keyboard, you can just hit 0 on your keyboard, and it should snap you to the camera view. Or you can come all the way to the right side of your UI and hit the camera icon, and it should navigate you, or it should automatically throw you into the camera view. So we have three major ways of orienting ourselves to the camera view. So now, just to quickly explain, like I said, the camera is your perspective in scene. So how would you go about controlling your camera? Well, there are two ways you can do that. There are two major ways I prefer to control my camera in 3D. You can come all the way to the top left of your UI and left click and drag. So if you remember, that's just going to make another window for us. Then come all the way to the top left here, the editor type, left click. It's already in 3D viewport, so all we can do is we can hover on this viewport, on this new window, and then hit 0 or hit left click on the camera icon, and automatically you'd see that our camera, we're now in camera view. And then we can come to our other viewports or other window, and then from the properties panel, if you come to objects, you see our camera options. You can see our location settings, you can see our rotation settings, you can see our scale settings. Your scale settings does not really matter when it comes to the camera. What is most crucial is your rotation and your location. So as you can see, if I zero out my x-axis rotation, you'd see that my camera is being affected. If I should just do that 0 0, you'd see that our camera is now facing is pointing directly down. And if we can just go ahead and left click on the sliders here and change this to something we want. So let's say we want to position our camera to face our mug. We can just control the X, Y, and Z axis, and you'd see that we'll be able to, from just tweaking this over and over again, we'll be able to frame our subjects. you can just zero out, always zero out the Y, because sometimes you wouldn't really need the Y for anything. You can see it's just giving a really weird result, but I just usually zero the Y axis out. You majorly need your Z and X axis. So you can see that we are kind of framing our camera to, let's do this on -90. We're kind of framing our camera to look at our object, which is our mug. So you can see we've done the rotation. Let's go ahead and mess with the location. So I'm just going to adjust the x-axis. I'm going to mess with the x-axis and maybe give a little bit of distance to our mug. Or let's say we want to see the side of our mug, we can just come here and zero this out so that our camera looks all the way there. You can also use your gizmo as well to adjust this. In fact, your gizmo is even the easiest option. So you basically have 3 options. I'm going to get into the other option. I'm going to get into the last option eventually, but let's these 2 options are, I would say, the most accessible options you can have and the fastest options you can have to adjust your camera settings, right? So your camera orientation rather. So you can see that we kind of have our, also if you don't want to see most of the selections, like for instance, we can see our grid, we can see our we can see our point lights. If you don't want to see any of that, you can just come all the way to the bar on the top of your UI, scroll with your middle mouse and come all the way to your show overlays and left click on that, and you see we have a much more cleaner view. So if I come all the way to render view, you see that our camera is focused on our cube and it looks beautiful, absolutely beautiful. So those are the 2 fastest and I would say most accessible ways to move your camera. But the best way, the most intuitive way to move your camera is through actually piloting your camera yourself, as opposed to using your gizmo or using your properties panel. So if you just left click on your camera and come to and press N just means your navigation or your sidebar, basically your sidebar settings. So when you press N, you have the sidebar come up. You go to view and then you go to camera to view. So what this is going to do is when I press 0 or when I hit 0 on my keyboard, you see that if I try to navigate in my viewport, just like we did in the first course, I believe in the first video, just moving around your viewports with your rotation, panning and zooming, my camera is now moving with my navigation tools. That's the tools we used for to normally move in our viewports. So we've basically attached our camera to our viewport perspective, and through that we're able to control rotation, zooming, location of our camera. And this is the best way because this gives you more creative freedom in terms of speed, accuracy, and then composition, as opposed to coming to the properties panel, typing in a value 90 degrees, using your gizmo. That can get repetitive really fast and can get quite boring. So this is the best. This is the best way I use my camera, either through this, or if I come to also remember that once your camera is locked to your view, you would have to, once you're done positioning your camera, you have to come back to the properties panel and come to view and uncheck this box. If not, once you just decide to move around your viewport, your camera will move as well, and you're going to lose all that. You're going to lose your framing. So just always make sure that you come here and turn this unlock your camera to your view. So another way also I usually use a lot is I can just position my in-world camera, not my render camera now, my in-world camera, that's my eyes in the 3D viewport. I can just position it in whatever position I want. Let's say this is the direction I want render camera to see, or this is the perspective I want my render camera to see. What I can do is Control Alt and 0, and my camera will now snap to that perspective. So this is also a different way you can use this, as opposed to having to come and lock your camera to view and then unlock your camera to view. That can be a long process or a tiresome process, but if you want something faster and quite intuitive, you can just do Ctrl-Alt-0 and you'd see I can still move around my viewport without having to adjust my framing. So let's quickly go over, let's find a frame we want our camera to be in. Let's see, let me just lock my camera to view and find the best frame I want my camera to my mug to be, or camera to be. Let me see, maybe somewhere. So you can play with it, to be honest. You can play with whatever framing you want, but I'm just trying to see what would be the best, and you can change it later on, but just to have something. I kind of like this framing because you can see the shadows. Now once we've gone ahead to frame our scene, we can unlock our view and then press N, then leave our camera. Now let's go over the camera settings, and your camera settings are basically found in your properties panel. If you check your properties panel, you have, once you've selected your camera, you check your properties panel, you have something called data. It's shaped like a camera, basically the same icon you have up here, and then you want to left click and you see a couple of settings. So just quickly explain this, the first option, which is label type. You have three options or types to pick from. First, you have your perspective. Now your perspective creates a realistic 3D view depth where objects further away appear smaller. So if you know the concept of parallax, basically the further away an object is, the smaller it is, and then the slower it moves because of the distance between the camera and that object. So basically that's what your perspective is. So it's the best thing you have for realistic renders and all of that. And then the next one is the orthographic camera. Now the orthographic camera displays objects without perspective distortion. It's ideal for creating stylized views, or stylized or miniature renders. So it's basically the opposite of your perspective view, which everything seems like it's the same distance. It has no distortion whatsoever. It's basically, like I said, the opposite of the perspective. And then the last is the panoramic option. Now the panoramic option it's mostly used for 360 degree or spherical renders. It's commonly used for VR or environment maps. So let's go back to our perspective. I would say 99.9% of the time you're going to be using your perspective option. Remember what I said, Blender has a lot of tools, but about 80% of the time you're only going to use like 20% of the tools available in Blender. So let's move on to the next thing, which is our focal length. Now our focal length in Blender controls the camera zoom and perspective, with lower values creating a wide angle view and higher values providing zoomed in compressed perspectives. So I'm very sure you've heard of focal length in like if you're into filmmaking or you've heard of filmmaking terms before. The focal length basically is controlling how close your subject is to the camera or how far it is. So basically just imagine it as zooming in and zooming out. Just put it that simply. We don't have to go into the technical terms of that because you won't really need any of that for 3D. But basically if you want to zoom into your object, you increase your focal length. If you want to zoom out, you decrease it. But then also know that it's not just zooming in and zooming out, because based on your focal length, objects might seem a little bit distorted. So we would go more into that maybe in subsequent videos, but just know this, that it is basically zooming in and zooming out. Just know that for now, right? We'll go into more technical terms and details a little bit later. Length units basically is asking you what units you want to measure your focal length in. I believe if I change it to field of view, you see that it's been changed to degrees, and millimeters has been changed to millimeters, obviously. And then clip start and clip this thing is how how far your camera clips your object. You're not going to use any of this, to be honest, in anytime soon, but for instance, if you have a large scene and then maybe your camera is cutting off at some point, or your view is cutting off at some point, what you can do is increase your clip end, and it's just going to make your world and your camera view distance a little bit larger and bigger. So that's for that. To be honest, you won't need most of this. Now something I use a lot again is your viewport display. Now you have a couple of options with this. You have your limits. Basically, I think your limits just shows you your limits just shows you your what do you call it, your depth of field distance. Like, we're going to get into depth of field in a little bit. Your mist shows you I don't know. No, I don't want to get into this terms because they might feel a bit daunting, but just know you won't be using most of this anytime soon. Your name is just your camera's name, but one very, very important option I use, in fact, in all my projects in Blender, is your passport out option. So basically, if I go to viewport shading, you'll see that in this camera selection view, also if you want to retract your toolbar, you can just press T. Your toolbar will just hide itself. Now you would see that if we're in our camera mode, right, we can still see the surrounding scenes. Now I don't really want that. I want to just focus on what my framing is in this viewport, rather here in this window. Since we've dedicated this window to our camera, I just want to see that camera. I just want to see what that camera is seeing, right? So what I can do is come to the passport out option. Now what this does is it turns everything but the camera's frame to black, right? It's probably the most one of the most important settings in your camera, this thing, because it makes you more focused and more concentrated on what's important, as opposed to just seeing everything you're seeing. So if you increase this all the way to 1, you'd see that we're not seeing anything else but our frame, and this is what will be exported. Now I'm just going to delete this cube. It's becoming a little bit distracting, but that's that for the passport out option. If you reduce it all the way, you'd see that we just have like a normal looking viewport, and that's not ideal because you won't know where your camera is. But I would always advise you put this to 1. Now another thing that is so important is I'm very sure you've heard of composition guides, and not just in 3D, in film. If you have some film background, you won't be too lost seeing all these terms, like the rule of thirds. You won't see this because I've turned off my overlay settings, but if I turn it on, you see that this grid just came up. So you have a rule of thirds, you have your center, you have your diagonals, and then you have your golden ratio, you have your triangle. So basically all these are supposed to help you composite your image. Now we're going to get into composition in a different entirely, maybe the intermediate level of this course, but just know that this is just to help you composite your image, composite your shots into something more pleasing to the eye. One thing you can also use is just your center to see if your object is in the middle of your frame, but like I said, we're not going to get into that now, sometime in the future. Now coming to the most important, or rather one of the most important tools in Blender is what you call the depth of field. Now just to quickly explain what the depth of field is. Depth of field in Blender, or DOF, known as DOF, it simulates the focus effects of a real camera, blurring objects outside of the focal points to create a sense of depth and realism. You can adjust this in this panel options basically, but let me turn this off. But yeah, like I just explained, it is basically blurring out your background. You've probably heard of focus length, your focal points and all of that, if you have some filmmaking background. But yeah, basically it is to help focus on your image more, and then blurring out everything else. And in film it's used a lot to guide the viewer's eye. It also gives a realistic feel to your renders. So if I should quickly check reduce my focus points, you see that if I take my focus points all the way to 0.12, you see that everything is blurred out. But the reason why everything is blurred out is because we're adjusting where the focus point is. If I come to my limits, I believe that's what it's called, yeah, the limit, yeah, my limits, you would see that this cross is what indicates where our focus point is. Now you can see our focus point is all the way here. Now let's adjust it all the way to our mog, and you see that it's no longer blurry. So what I can also do is I can adjust how blurred the background is, and how I can go about doing that is using the f-stop setting. Now just to explain a little bit, your f-stop basically controls the aperture size of your depth of field. The lower value has shallow depth of field and with more blur, while higher values keep more of the scene focus. So if we keep increasing the values, you see that everything is looking okay and looking fine. But if we reduce the values, you see that our background, if I just increase this view, it's giving a more realistic feel to our render. The background is a bit blurred, everything is looking like it's an actual image, right? So basically, the higher your f-stop, the less blurred your background is. But the lower your f-stop, the more blurred your background is. In subsequent videos, we're going to probably explain the technical terms of this, but I just want you to get very familiar with Blender before we get into any documentation or anything, showing you how this actually works and everything. But yeah, let's just put it at 0.5 or all the way to 0 maybe. Yes, something like that, so that we can have our background to be a little bit blurred. This looks very, very cinematic. I like this. Let's increase this to 1. To be honest, that's fine. But I really don't like how we can still see that wood, so that's why I'm just trying to find the middle ground of what works and what is acceptable. Okay, yeah, 0.5, that's fine. Okay, what we can also do is we can tell Blender to focus on an object as opposed to using this as our guide. So what I can do is left click on the eyedropper tool and then click on my cup, and you see that my entire cup has now been selected as the focus points, as opposed to maybe my camera just focusing on the inside of our mug. But you can still see that you still need to do a little bit of tweaking just to get it right. But yeah, that's it for most of your camera settings. We're going to go into the render settings proper, but just know that in your output settings you can change the resolution of your camera. For instance, if I put a 1080p width here on my x-axis, you see that it's now being squared out, like so. We can control our camera's framing or width and height from our output options under the format option. So I'm just going to put this back to 1920 by 1080, and maybe in the next video we're going to go over most of all these settings, basically outputting our mug. So we've come to the end of this class. I just want to say well done for coming this far. We finally understand how most things work in Blender, including our camera, lighting and everything. In the next video I'll be running up with finally rendering our model.